Without further ado, I would like, on behalf of the organization of this international school, to welcome Professor um, Webster to the school. Obviously, we're very happy to have you here on this school on the issue of inequalities. Professor, just to briefly present Professor Webster, is a distinguished research professor at the Southern Center of Inequality Studies and the founder and past director of the Society Work and Development Institute at the University of Wits in South Africa. So he's author of several books, many academic articles on different topics. Obviously, labor relations was always something very central to Professor Webster's studies, and his current research interests are on the production and reproduction of inequality in the workplace and the use of labor power as a strategy for reducing this inequality. More recently, and associated with the creation of the Southern Center of Inequality Studies, Professor Webster, together with David Francis and Imham Valodia, edited a book called Inequality Studies from the Global South that offers a new perspective a new approach to thinking about inequality in the global south. And I believe this will be the topic of Professor Webster's class today. So I'd like to welcome Professor Webster. Thank you very much again. We have a 2-hour slot for this class. What we normally suggest is that you could use a first hour for your presentation, then you could then use the second hour for, let's say, for debate, questions, commentaries. That would be our proposal in terms of organization of time. So thank you very much, Professor Webster. And you have the floor.
Wrong direction. Right, sorry, just getting it sorted out. Good morning, colleagues and friends. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to connect with you across the Atlantic Ocean. What I'd like to do in this talk is try to look at the question of inequality from a Southern perspective. And by a Southern perspective, I mean essentially the global South. And I'm thinking primarily of South America, of Africa, of India. In other words, what we used to call the developing world. And I think I want to approach this question from a Southern perspective for the reasons that the famous English historian E.H. Carr used to say, that what you see depends on which side of the mountain you stand. And I stand on the southern tip of Africa, and it's through that lens that I see the question of inequality. And I would like to begin by asking the simple question, really, of inequality of what? And when we talk about inequality, what are we talking about? I think there are at least three quite different kinds of inequality, and in making this distinction, I'm drawing on the work of Joran Verborn in his classic book, provocatively titled "The Killing Fields of Inequality." And in this book, he makes the distinction between three different kinds of inequality. The first, hang on, I got stuck a bit here. The first inequality is of health and death, how you live and how you die. He calls that vital inequality, and it's quite a fundamental understanding of it to do with your body, your health. And then secondly, I'm finding it difficult here. The second, sorry, I'm getting a bit of a difficulty here. The second type of inequality is what he calls existentialist inequality. This is really to do with inequality as an individual, as a person. This form of inequality means denial of recognition and respect, of equal respect. It's a potent generator of humiliation for women in patriarchal societies, for indigenous groups in the Americas, for poor immigrants, for those of low caste, or for Black people or stigmatized ethnic groups. In other words, it's about dignity, about your dignity as a human being, about recognition, about how people respect or don't respect you. He calls it existentialist inequality, but he identifies a third, which he calls material or resource inequality, which is really very much what we commonly think about of inequality. The idea that human actors have very different resources to draw upon. And I think there are two dimensions to this. The first is your access to education, to social context, to what we call social capital. In other words, inequality of opportunity. And that's quite often what people understand by resource inequality. But there's a second inequality of rewards, or inequality of outcome. The latter is the most frequently used measure of inequality. In other words, the distribution of income and sometimes also of wealth. So wealth and income, assets, income, is that really usually commonly understood understanding of inequality. So I'd like to begin just by problematizing the question of what we mean by inequality and the three dimensions of inequality. I'd just like to bear that in mind as we proceed. But I think the second point I wanted to make is that to try and understand inequality as something that has geographical significance. And as you see in this at the top left-hand corner there, you'll see the Gini coefficient measurements from 24 through to 64, and the dark parts of the globe are those areas where inequality is highest, plus 60 in Gini coefficient. So you'll see Southern Africa, not just South Africa, and I want to come back to that point. Southern Africa, which includes Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South Africa, has the highest Gini coefficient in the world. And you'll be pleased to hear that Brazil comes second in this particular ranking, which, in terms of I'm now talking about income inequality, Gini coefficient. I mean, what's striking about it, of course, is the down in the 20s and 30s, you see Western Europe. Interestingly, the United States is quite high on this ranking. So I think to understand inequality both as its different dimensions, and also to understand it as a global phenomenon and an unequal one. Let me now, what I want to do in this lecture is I want to do three things. Firstly, I want to interrogate the dominant northern approach to inequality. And then secondly, to look at, to kind of illustrate this, to understand this, like as a case study, at poverty and inequality in South Africa. And of course, I think it's important that to distinguish between poverty and inequality. Poverty is something directly to do with basic needs, whether you have water or you don't have water, whereas inequality is a relational concept. It's me in relationship to you. It's a different concept. And then thirdly, and I want to try and develop a Southern approach and raise some conceptual and methodological issues. And I think in the discussion to Mariana's suggestion, in the second part of this session, maybe we can explore the questions of how to reduce inequality. And I did circulate Ian Goldin's book on inequality and my review of it. I'm not sure whether colleagues have that. Oh, you didn't get it. Okay. Doesn't matter. I'll talk about it. So let me begin then with inequality studies, the dominant northern approach. What I'm suggesting here is that the dominant northern approach, talking about the global north, assumes to a certain extent a universalism in the causes of inequality, and the origins of that universal are located squarely in the global north. While this may be true to a certain extent, it's a very strong assumption when it underpins the research agenda. It's particularly dangerous because while inequality may look similar in the North and South, it is our hypothesis that the reproduction of inequality in the South may be determined by factors that are quite different and possibly which are particular to the South, and of course is shaped by the way the South articulates to the North. I'm not suggesting that the South is disconnected from the North. I'm suggesting that there are possibly different forces driving it. And in the North, inequality has attracted intellectual attention because it poses a threat to the stability of the welfare state. And we've seen the rise of a counter movement to the neoliberal hegemony from the right, which has led to introspection by the North on the role of inequality in undermining social and democratic stability. And particularly, we've seen that growing inequality in the North. And of course, it has led to, as we well know, a kind of right-wing movements, most dramatically in the form of Trump. But I gather you have your own local version of this in Brazil. We cannot assume that the primary concerns about inequality in the South have their basis in the same set of problems. Indeed, it could be argued that the methods of a colonial accumulation by the North, which underpins its development, are in large part responsible for the reproduction of inequality in the South. Now, that's a sort of school of thought that goes back into the 1960s, Andre Gunder Frank and others, in terms of the idea of development and underdevelopment. And I think what's happened is that Northern institutions have focused largely on developing formidable technical expertise in the measurement and quantification of inequality. We contend that there's a largely unquestioned assumption which underlines inequality studies. Because forms of inequality are quantifiable and comparable, it is assumed that they are products of the same universal causes. Furthermore, we argue that the field has paid insufficient attention to the political economy of inequality. There's an econometric bias in the study of inequality that ignores its social, spatial, and perhaps most importantly, its political dimensions. So I guess in a nutshell, I think we've seen a very useful and highly sophisticated technical measurement of inequality. But I think what's possibly neglected is that what we're calling the political economy of inequality, its political dimensions. And drawing on a colleague in Germany, Keim suggests that the creation of knowledge in the social sciences can be understood through a center-periphery conception that has historical roots. So the way I'm in a nutshell, trying to understand this process is through the idea of a center and periphery production of knowledge. And as we know that in the knowledge and the disciplines developed and spread first in Europe, followed by North America, and after a certain extent expanded across the world through colonial and neo-colonial or post-colonial relationships. For inequality studies, this manifests itself in several ways, three of which we discuss here: intellectual stewardship, funding, and the geography of knowledge creation. And Keim tries to capture these three dimensions of a center-periphery framework. So when we look at the production of knowledge on inequality, firstly, you see at the center a developed infrastructure and internal organization, and against a relatively undeveloped in the periphery. And I'm not just talking about the size and number of people doing research, but also the resources and the infrastructure. Secondly, there is a degree of autonomy as against dependency in the South. And finally, in terms of position and international recognition, the center and the marginality. I mean, I'm quite struck by the extent to which knowledge it gets legitimized when it's published in the North, and is marginal and not recognized in the South. And I'll give an example, actually, from our own research. I mean, Arup Chatterjee published a year and a half ago a report on inequality in South Africa. And last week, it was a news item because the World Bank published it, the World Bank Economic Review. I'm just giving that as an example where knowledge is legitimized when it's produced in the North and gets recognition, and the South is given a marginal status. So I now would like, with that sort of background idea of the production of knowledge on inequality, if you like, a kind of sociology of the knowledge, and a center periphery model, I'd like to turn to South Africa as a case study. Now, South Africa represents something of a paradox, because on the one hand, we're one of the most unequal countries in the world, if not the most unequal. And I think that the studies so far of countries where we can measure inequality, South Africa comes out with the highest on both income and wealth. It's a country where economic growth has stagnated and inflation remains high relative to the developed world, while the unemployment rate continues to climb towards 30%. Well, it's actually well over 30%, depending on, of course, how you measure it. And the current insurrection has deepened that unemployment. But in spite of having one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, with a Bill of Rights that foregrounds expanded social and economic rights, very progressive, very radical demand for economic rights, and a powerful movement committed to a more egalitarian society. We know of the struggle of the anti-apartheid movement, the leadership of Nelson Mandela for a more egalitarian society. In spite of that, those the policy instruments we've put in place, inequality has deepened. It's deepened in post-apartheid society, and let me take the income inequality. The current distribution of wealth income has historical roots. I mean, I think that's very important, and I'll come back to that in thinking about a Southern approach to understand it as historically. in 1989, just at the dawn of our democracy, formally in 1994, South Africa had the highest Gini coefficient of all 57 countries for which there was data at the time. It was 0.66. Overall inequality in South Africa, according to the Gini coefficient, decreased slightly between 1993 and 2014, very marginally. The Gini coefficient of inequality was at 0.66 for 2015 and 0.63 by the World Bank. This was the highest for all countries in which there are data. This means that there has been no significant reduction in inequality in post-apartheid South Africa, in spite of the progressive constitution and a range of policy instruments and legislation. I mean, it's interesting if we put, South African inequality in perspective. And at the top there, you see the Gini coefficient, marginal increase between 1996 and 2015. But I think it's interesting when we look at in a comparative context, South Africa, in terms of Gini coefficient, comes out highest, then followed by a number of other African countries, but a clear indication of where we stand in a comparative context. Now, I think the interesting statistics that Chatterjee and his colleagues have come up is the unparalleled levels of wealth concentration. Using tax data and other data, the top 10% own 86% of the aggregate wealth, and the top 0.1% close to 1/3. So now I'm drawing a distinction here between income and wealth, and the high concentration, and the top 0.1%, which is 3,500 individuals, concentrate 15% of household net worth, more than the bottom 90% as a whole. The 10% is interesting, the concentration of that particular group, because it represents essentially a racialized inequality. Although there's a growing number of Black African people who are becoming rich, it's still concentrated in what we call the minority groups, people of white or colored or Indian descent. And we look at household wealth inequality around the world. Again, South Africa, I mean, it's interesting if you notice how the United States is comes second in that, something of an outlier in the depth of inequality for an advanced industrialized country, and China at the bottom end of household inequality. Of course, that's also rapidly changing. That's 2018 figures. I suggested at the beginning that I'm drawing a distinction between inequality and poverty. If we look at poverty, at the end of apartheid, that's the early 1990s, left South Africa unencumbered with vast inequalities across the race groups and extensive and deep poverty, with reference to poverty line of 329 per person per month. 58% of all South Africans and 68% of all Black South Africans were classified as living in poverty. The general consensus that money metric poverty had declined since 1994, but the most recent poverty statistics showed that despite the decline, poverty levels had once again risen by 2015, from a low of 53%. By 2015, over half of all South Africans were living in poverty, the same number as 2007. And again, if we look at this in this table here, I just wanted to note the spatial dimensions of poverty and inequality. If you look at the food poverty line, for example, and you take it over the last 2006, 2009, 2011, 2015, you see the dramatic difference between rural and urban. So rural areas significantly poorer than urban areas. And as you go up from food poverty line to lower bound poverty to upper bound poverty, that same pattern continues. There's an interesting in the last column. There's a slight increase in poverty. So there's a general trend for it going down, and then an increase. And per household, I think what's interesting here is the gender, female, male difference, and then the racial. We have this curious categorization of races: African, colored, Asian, white, and again education. The higher the education level, the lower the poverty, and as you see on that table. So these just to conclude the second part of my talk, South Africa has made some progress in reducing absolute poverty, but poverty has deepened in recent years. The distinction between poverty and inequality is less sharp than often stated. I mean, they may be analytically distinct, but they run together. Very little or no progress in addressing inequality, which remains the highest in the world, almost 30 years after the end of apartheid. Labour market is a key site in the production, reproduction of income and wealth in South Africa. And what I'd like to do then now, in the third part of my presentation, is to try and develop what I'm calling a Southern approach to inequality. And the Southern approach rests on three factors here. Firstly, I want to stress the need to focus on an historical dimension. And secondly, on interdisciplinarity in focusing here. And finally, and most importantly, on the concept of power. Let me start here with interdisciplinarity. I think any attempt to develop an understanding of those three dimensions that I mentioned at the beginning, the vitality inequality, existentialist inequality, and resource inequality, has to be approached through an interdisciplinary lens. And as I argued at the beginning, that inequality studies has been dominated by quantitative analysis, increasingly sophisticated measurement, classification of inequality, which largely focus on money metric inequality. I mean, it's obvious because that's the easiest thing to measure, income. Measuring wealth is much more complex and difficult. Inequality, however, manifests itself in various ways and in various spaces across the life of an individual. And it's important that inequality studies transcend traditional academic boundaries. One way of trying to understand inequality is through capturing the life experience from birth, or indeed before birth, through the life cycle. And that involves a multidisciplinary approach. The reason we argue for inequality studies that is interdisciplinary is because the social and historical contexts are crucial. In order to understand these, we need to draw on the skills in disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, politics, history, geography, and law. There are two scholars who propose that inequality is back in public discourse and only sociology. I mean, it's interesting that sociologists would argue this, but only that sociology can treat the subject with due flexibility, humility, rather than reductively, the way economic does. Well, you have the right to reply, by the way, on that one. It's a particular view, but I think the point is not about sociology. The point is about interdisciplinarity. The second sort of leg of a Southern approach to inequality is the question of power. I think the key point about inequality is not just about the uneven possession or the quantitative difference of individuals, groups, regions, entities, or place. It's about the conditions that allow certain groups to dominate over others. In other words, inequality is fundamentally a power relationship. It's a power relationship between who gets what, and it's not just a question of identifying difference. Indeed, power is produced and reproduced at the intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality, and other aspects of identity. And so we would suggest an intersectional approach is necessary in order to understand the way in which these different dimensions of power interact to reproduce inequality. I mean, I think it becomes particularly important when you look at existentialist inequality, because we're dealing with human emotions and that dimension of recognition of people. And of course, resistance to the powerful emerges through building organizations and social movements to counter power. So thinking about inequality, also, we need to think about alternatives and building counterpower. And I just want to stall a little bit here. Branko Milanovic makes a very important distinction between two kinds of forces that drive inequality. He distinguishes between malign forces, and here he's talking about wars, natural catastrophes, epidemics, pandemics, and benign forces, more widely accessible education, increased social transfer. That's the Mahatma Gandhi National Employment Guarantee Scheme, that's that acronym, or progressive taxation, wealth tax. I mean, it's interesting that Milanovic makes this distinction because what we know from the current pandemic is that it hasn't driven down inequality, it's actually accelerated and deepened inequality. I mean, if you look back historically at the pandemics of previous eras, you see how particularly war led to, like after the Second World War, we have this massive egalitarian moment in Europe where you start building and consolidating the welfare state and redistribution. Unlike that moment, this particular moment of disruption through COVID-19 has deepened inequality across the globe and suggested that we're living in a different context. So he called those the malign forces that produce inequality, but obviously also benign forces, as I'm suggesting. In the wake of the Second World War, we get the most egalitarian moment in European history with the introduction of modifying education, health, transport, and so on. But Piketty actually makes a similar point as to the fact that war is a very strong driving force in the reduction of inequality, which is a bit kind of depressing. So, you know, if I would take that, we've had this violence and disruption in South Africa, you know, is that going to be followed by a moment of egalitarian redistributive policies, or will it simply lead to a deepening of inequality? I'm just raising that as a more general question. But the main point I want you to stress is, in addition to interdisciplinarity, is the question of power. And on the historical part of it, so interdisciplinarity, power, and historical, I think that it's vital that inequality studies is grounded in an historical consciousness. Historical reality is very different between the North and the South. Colonial conquest, land dispossession are central to the reproduction of contemporary inequality in the South in a way that is not true for the North. While it takes a particular form in South Africa, I would describe South Africa as a historical example of settler colonialism. And it's interesting, the highest Gini coefficients in the world are centered around this settler colonial part of the world: Namibia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, South Africa, Lesotho, Botswana, Swaziland, all have the highest Gini coefficients in the world. So I believe that these are all countries in the shadow of colonialism, and that continues to shape their present history in many ways. the present is our history, and these issues are very much part of the current discourse. Just along these lines of the South, a theory of inequality in the global South has to be developed. Jesse Souza is actually a compatriot of yours in Brazil. He now lives. I don't know if it's familiar to you, but he is now in Germany. He argues that societies in the global South can only be understood against the background of colonialism and modernization programs, and a structure of unequal relations between the center and the rest was established. And so, in other words, to understand the present, we need to locate it in an understanding of that. He deviates from dependency theory, so it's not a sort of classical dependency theory, but it's focused on the symbolic dimension. And he argues that this system informs national and local inequality by establishing a racism that declares characteristics of the modern center, such as a white skin, urban residence, Western education, as superior, and characteristics of the underdeveloped periphery as inferior. So just to summarize here, what I've suggested is that, firstly, that in looking at inequality studies, one needs to understand it in terms of a kind of core periphery where knowledge produced in the North has tended to universalize itself and take the particular, which is Europe, and turn it into a universal. And what we're arguing for, and that's why we set up our center here in the University of the Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg, was because we felt that, in spite of the fact, I mean, it's quite ironic, in spite of the fact that we are the most unequal society in the world, there was no center studying inequality. So a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, we set up, and we call it the Southern Center of Inequality Center Studies, because we feel that there are specific features of the South that have to be acknowledged and studied, and that those particular driving forces has to be understood, obviously, in a global context. Financialization of capital, the tech giants, Uber, Amazon, are key drivers in shaping inequality, but that we have to understand it from our particular perspective in dialogue with the global North. That was the first point. The second one is, if we look at South Africa, there's something of a paradox in the sense that, in spite of our progressive constitution, our long study for a more egalitarian, non-racial society, in spite of that, inequality has not shifted, if possibly, and the most recent research suggested a slight deepening of wealth inequality, in particular assets that are being identified through our research, which we've done with Piketty, but very much focusing it on an understanding of South Africa, that in spite of these progressive policies, inequality has deepened. And then finally, what I've tried to suggest is, in order to understand this, maybe we need to develop a particular approach, but that approach would have to build on a historical understanding and interdisciplinary understanding, and also finally to do with power, because ultimately inequality is a power relationship. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thank you.